Hello. So today I'm going back to revisit this motion graphic. This is one of the first After Effects reproductions that I tried to do in Motion 5, and it comes from an After Effects tutorial by Josh Noel at the Sonduck Film YouTube channel, and there's a link in the description if you want to go and check out the source for this graphic. It's been a while since I posted the how-to guide to make this, and since then I've learned a little bit, so it's time to revisit it and clean it up and make it much less complicated to do. So let's get into it. Okay, so I'm just starting the project with a background group, and in that group is this image. I'll put a link in the description for you if you want to go and grab it. It's just a picture from the internet. And I chose it because it has a similar color profile to the background that's used in the After Effects tutorial that I'm following along with. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is add our border and animate it. So I'll make a new group, call this group border, and then I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and add a rectangle to the canvas. I'll come to the inspector in shape and get rid of the fill and give it an outline and give it a width of 20, and I want to keep the joint as square. The start cap can be round, but the end cap we're going to turn off, give it none. And in the geometry, I'm going to give it a width of 800 and a height of 350. And then I'll come to properties and reset the X and Y position so it's sitting in the middle of the canvas. And I'll rename this as animated. And I'll just duplicate that and rename the copy as gradient, and I'll come into the inspector and I'll turn the fill on and turn the outline off, and I'll just turn that shape off for now. I'll come back into the animated shape and I'm going to right click on it in the canvas and choose convert to points. And once that's done, I'm going to drag around this top right hand point and right click on it and choose set as start point. Okay, now make sure that shape is still selected. Come to behaviors, shape, right on, and move the playhead to 1 second, and with the right on, make sure it's selected. Use O on the keyboard to trim that behavior to 1 second. And in the inspector, I'm going to change the direction to reverse, and I'll give the speed as ease both. So now we have a border that animates on over 30 frames. So we want to color this border with a gradient. So let's come back to that copy we made before. Turn it on, and I'm just going to drag up and down and left and right to make sure that this shape covers the shape below. And in the inspector, I'm going to change it from a solid color to a gradient, and I'll right click it and select edit gradient so I can change the angle around, and I'm going to give it a color in keeping with the After Effects tutorial that I'm trying to reconstruct. So on this one, a darkish blue, and on this other one, a lighter color, a lighter blue. Alright, something like that. That'll do for now. So with that gradient shape selected, still in the layers panel, I'm going to right click and choose add image mask, and I will use that animated shape as the source. So we have now this border with a gradient that's going to animate on over 30 frames. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is add the flourishes around the border, and so I'll make a new group and I'll call this group flourish, and I'll drop that into our main group, and I'm going to grab the animated shape and duplicate it, delete the right on, and move that into the flourish group, and I'm going to call it flourish 1. Now I'm going to select it in the canvas and right click and choose edit points, and right about here I'm going to double click to add another point, and right click and choose set as the start point, and then I'm going to turn it on. So then I'll come to the style and drop the width to 10, and then I'm going to come over into properties here, and I'm going to increase the X scale to 105 and the Y scale to 112.5 so that it runs around the outside of our gradient border. And then I'm going to bring the playhead back to the start, and now what we're going to do is we're going to animate the first point offset and last point offset. Well, this is where we are getting rid of the overly complicated steps which I had in my first effort to reconstruct this graphic in motion. So instead of applying various write-on behaviors and changing their offset and having one draw while the other one erases, we're just going to get exactly the same result by keyframing these first point offset and last point offsets. So with the playhead at the start, I'm going to set the first point offset to 100%, and I'll set a keyframe for that, and then with the playhead to 1 second, I'll set that first point offset to 0. And then I'm going to set that curve in the keyframe editor to ease both. So to create the flourish, what we want is we want to animate now this last point offset to follow, but just a couple of frames later. So I'm going to move my playhead to 2 frames in and set a keyframe on the last point offset, and then move my playhead to 1 second and 2 frames, and set that last point offset there to 0. And in the inspector, I'll just make sure I've got that last point offset selected, and I'm going to set that to ease both too. And so now we have a flourish that runs around as the gradient border animates in. So now we want another flourish, so I'm going to duplicate flourish 1 and just rename it as flourish 2, and with it selected, Shift S, I'm just going to turn it around. so that is the border effect for this graphic completed. So the next step is to add the titles. So I will add a new group now and just call them titles. And I'm going to grab the text tool and add the main title. I'll just type motion, M-O-T-I-O-N. And now the font that I'm using is the Gotham font. And if you go to the Sonduck Film YouTube channel from the link that I put in the description, then you should find there a link to their website. And at their website you can get your hands on the free font package, and Gotham is one of the fonts that is included in there. It's a really good font to have. I really like it. I'm glad I got it. Otherwise, you could use the Avener font, which is really similar, A-V-E-N-I-R. That's a good font to use for this graphic, I think, as well. Alright, but I'm going to use the Gotham font, and yikes, I'm going to have the font, where are we? There we go. I'm going to have it set to bold. Okay, now I'll go for black, and the font size is going to be 150. And I'm going to center the alignment and come into properties and reset the X and Y on that. Okay, so then we want our second title. And this one is going to be font size 48 and just Gotham Book. A lighter, thinner font for the smaller title. And this one's just going to say title, and still all caps. Okay, I might bump that font size up to maybe 50. Okay, so now we want to animate the titles to come in. So how are we going to do that? Okay, so the main title, I should just make sure that's sitting on top, and the main title's endpoint is 1 second, so I'm going to move from playhead to 1 second, and I'm going to trim that font to start there, that text element to start there. And I'm going to set the X position to -740, and I'll set a keyframe there, and it animates in over 1 second. So move my playhead to 2 seconds now and set the X position to 0. And we want this text element to rush in and slow down, so it's an ease. Which I'm going to manage in the keyframe editor here. Is that going to help me? Okay. Alright, that'll do. And the smaller title is going to animate in over 1 second, 5 frames later. So I want my playhead at 1 second 5 frames, and I will move the smaller title to X minus, nope, to X 421, I think. 421, and I will set the trim the text element to 1 second and 5 frames. No, okay, so I want that out just a bit more. Okay, to about here, cool. And now at 2 seconds, 5 frames, X to 0. Alright, sorry, I didn't set my key points. Alright, so I'll set a key point there. At 2 seconds and 5 frames, the X position is at 0, and at 1 second, 5 frames, the X position is out this side at, okay, let's just make that 500. And again, I want the text element to rush in and then slow down, so I'm going to manage that in the keyframe editor here. Okay, so that's going to do us. Now we want to add the mask, so I'm going to select the titles group, grab the rectangle mask tool and draw a mask in there, and let's see what we have now. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is animate the border and the titles together. So the first thing we need to do is place the border and titles into another group. And I'm going to call this group the rotate and scale group. So with the playhead at the start, I'm going to select this rotate and scale group and set a Z rotation of -40%, and then we want the playhead at 1 second, and 5 frames, 1 second and 5 frames. The rotation is back to 0. Oh, sorry, I forgot the key frame from before. So playhead back to the start, Z rotation -40% and -40 degrees, and add a keyframe, and then the playhead to 1 second and 5 frames, and that rotation is back to 0. So the text is coming in just before the rotation settles. And then we want the graphic to scale down slightly and then back up. So with the playhead at 105, just as it finishes rotating, we want to set a keyframe for this scale, and then at 1 second and 15 frames we want the scale down to 90%, and then with the playhead at 2 seconds set another keyframe holding that 90%, and then with the playhead at 2 seconds and 10 frames we're going to bring it back up to 100%. And I'm going to grab just turn off the rotation curve, and I'm just going to grab these curves and set them to ease both, and the same for these ones. These are the scale curves. So remember, when you're dealing with scale in the keyframe editor, looks like just one curve, but actually that's the X and the Y and the Z scale, all in the same space there. So now let's see what we have. Okay, that's that. Hey, by the way, I have a motion blur on as well. So your motion blur settings are here in the project properties. In project and properties, right here, these are the settings, and you can toggle them as active or inactive here in render. And here again is one of the areas that was overly done and overly complicated in my first effort. I was having save one element out and then import back in, and then save out and then import back in again to get the motion blur effect, which now of course is plain as day. The motion blur settings are right there inside the project itself. Okay, so motion blur is on and we're getting that motion blur effect. And I'm just going to run preview. Okay, so now we want to animate the graphic out. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring my playhead to 2 seconds 20 frames, and with this rotate and scale group selected, I'm going to hit O to trim everything back to 2 seconds 20 frames. And then I'm going to place this inside of another group, which I'll name as Animate In. And with this Animate In group selected, I'm going to right click and choose Make a Clone Layer. And with the playhead at 2 seconds 20 frames and the clone layer selected on my keyboard, I'm going to hit Shift left bracket so that that clone layer begins right where our Animate In graphic finishes. And in the inspector, if with the clone layer selected in properties, here in timing, if you don't see it on, just click here where it says show or hide, and we want to set this to reverse. And we are done. So that is the Sonduck Film After Effects tutorial graphic, deconstructed and rebuilt in Motion 5. And I think if you go and check out the graphic, yeah, it was not exactly the same, but we're quite close to the general look and feel of that title graphic. Thanks for watching. I hope that this is helpful for you in your future projects.